Hello, friends, welcome again. Friends, when we study English literature, we come across many terms like realism, existentialism, expressionism, classicism, romanticism, and so on. So, as the students of English literature, it is very important for all of us to understand these terms, to understand these different movements which took place in English literature. Friends, in this video, today we want to discuss and understand what this classicism is and what this romanticism is. We are going to discuss the classical periods of English literature and the periods of romanticism in English literature. We will also discuss the major classical works in English literature and the major romantic works in English literature. And at the same time, we will also discuss important features of classicism and important features of romanticism. And then at last, we are going to discuss the differences between classicism and romanticism. So, friends, let's begin with the meaning of classicism. Friends, the word classicism comes from the word classic, okay, and classic means something which is ancient. Classic means something which is great, okay. So, in general terms, forget about literature, but in common man's language, classic means something which is ancient or something which is great. And when we study English literature, people say that this is a classical work. That means this is an ancient work, okay, or it means it is a great work of art. But now let's try and understand the exact definition of this movement called classicism. Friends, classicism in literature is actually the name given to a particular movement, in works of arts which adopt the principles and styles embodied in the literature of the ancient Greece and ancient Rome. That means what? All the characteristics of literature which we find in the ancient Greek literature, ancient Roman literature, when these characteristics are found in our modern English literature, that modern English literature, friends, is known as classical literature. Why? Because these modern writers, they try to follow, they try to imitate the styles, the principles of the ancient writers of Rome and Greece. So, this modern literature in today's times is also known as classical literature. Right? I hope you understand the idea. When the modern author adopts, imitates, or copies or follows the style and principles of the ancient literature, ancient Greek or Roman literature, then that modern literature is known as classical literature. As I told you in the beginning, classic means something which is great. Classic means something which is ancient. And if I talk about the major characteristics or features of classical literature, then you can say that it is objectivity. Objectivity means the authors here in classical literature, the authors express the ideas and philosophy of life in an objective manner. They do not express their personal emotions, personal experiences in literature. One thing. Second thing is that in classical literature, most of the writers they strictly follow the ancient norms, rules, and regulations as devised by the ancient Greek and Roman poets. That means how to write a drama, say for example, how to write a tragedy. Then Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, has given some norms of writing a tragedy. When in today's times, an author follows this Aristotle's concept of writing tragedy, then that modern literature becomes classical literature. Why? Because he follows the norms, the rules, and regulations of writing tragedy as devised, as given by the ancient critics and the ancient poets. So they strictly follow the rules of writing literature. This is the second characteristic of classicism. Realism and satire is abundantly found in classical literature. Mostly classical literature is down to earth, means they talk about the realistic life of, they express the realistic life of the people. Satire, moralism, these are some more features of classical literature. Three unities, that means the writers of the plays, they strictly follow the three unities of time, place, and action as as suggested by the ancient critics and the ancient poets. Moreover, classical literature mainly deals with urban life, with the life of the town, and with artificial life of the people. So, these are, friends, some of the important characteristics of classical literature. Okay, now let's have a look at some of the important classical works as found in our English literature. This classicism mainly is found during the 18th century in English literature. Friends, if you examine the literature which was written during the 18th century, that means during the Augustan age, 1700 to 1740, and in the second half of the 18th century, that means the age of Dr. Johnson, Dr. Samuel Johnson, 1740 to 1798. During these two periods, that means during this about 100 years, the literature which was written in England was mostly classical by nature. The characteristics, the features which we just now discussed, are found in this particular period, and that's why this age is known as neoclassical age. Okay, not only this, if I want to give you some names of the poets, then Alexander Pope is considered as the most important classical poet of English literature in the first half of the 18th century. Alexander Pope has written The Dunciad, The Rape of the Lock, and many more works. All these works are fine examples of classical literature. Not only this, during the first half of the 18th century, we have the writers like Jonathan Swift, who have written Gulliver's Travels, A Tale of a Tub, and many more, which are also nice examples of classical literature in English. But if you come to the second half of the 18th century, then we have the great lexicographer and critic Dr. Samuel Johnson. He has written the biography Life of Mr. Richard Savage, and the poems London and the Vanity of Human Wishes. This biography and his poems, they are also examples of classical literature. So friends, you can say that Alexander Pope, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Samuel Johnson, Jonathan Swift, and many others who were writing literature during the 18th century, they produced classical literature. So friends, now let's move on to discuss the next term, the next movement which is very popular in English literature, and that is Romanticism. Friends, the term Romanticism actually comes from French language. In French language, there was a word called roman. It means a romantic story told in verse. Verse means poetry. A romantic story told in poetry. So, the term romanticism comes from French language. This is the one thing that you must understand. Before I discuss the meaning of romanticism, let me make it clear that generally, the new students who take admission in the college with special English or English as their major subject, when they listen to this term romanticism, they generally have a common idea that romanticism means love between man and women. But no, friends, this is not the actual meaning of romanticism. Friends, romanticism means something which excites you, which thrills you, something which scintillates you. Romanticism means everything which brings thrill in your life. Say, for example, adventure. Adventure is thrilling. Love for past is also pleasing and thrilling sometimes. So, romanticism, you have to look at this term in a broader manner, right? Actually, this romanticism was a movement in English literature which came as a reaction against the order and restraint of classicism. As I just now told you, that the literature of the 18th century, which is full of classicism, in which the writers strictly follow the rules and regulations of writing literature, after this period, romanticism started as a reaction against these strict rules of writing literature. So, in the beginning of the 19th century, you find this movement of romanticism in English literature. Friends, if I talk about some important characteristics of this movement, romanticism, then the first and foremost is subjectivity. Subjectivity means not something which is not objective. When we discuss the term classicism, I told you that important characteristic of classicism is objectivity. Means the writers express their ideas, philosophy of life in an objective manner. But here in romanticism, in romantic literature, the poets generally express their own personal emotions, personal experiences. So, subjective poetry, that means romantic poetry is mostly personal by nature, classical poetry is mostly impersonal by nature. Love for nature. Remember William Wordsworth, the poet of nature. So, love for nature, interest in common man and women, interest in the life of the villagers, life of those who are living in remote, rustic areas, love for past, freedom from rules, because as I told you, in romanticism, they brushed away all the norms, rules, and regulations as devised by the ancient writers. The romantic writers, they made their own rules of writing poetry. So they wanted freedom from these rules, ancient rules given by the ancient poets and the critics. Love for beauty and aesthetic pleasure, these are some important characteristics of the romantic literature. Not only this, the language of the romantic literature is the language of the common man and women. So, friends, romanticism and classicism are actually, in sharp contrast to each other. If I give you some examples of romantic works, then remember, in the whole history of English literature, if you make a survey of the whole history of English literature, then you find two ages which are full of romanticism. You find this element of romanticism, number one, during the Elizabethan age. The literature which was produced during the 16th century from 1550 to 1630. The literature of this period is mostly romantic by nature. And the second period was just after the 18th century. That means the end of 18th century, 1798, and the beginning of the 19th century. So 1798 to 1830, this small period of 32 years is also known as the period of romantic revival. It is known as the age of romanticism. And William Wordsworth was the leader of this movement. William Wordsworth published his lyrical ballads in 1798, and this year is considered, this lyrical publication of lyrical ballads is considered as the landmark in the history of romanticism in English literature. Not only this, if you examine the literature of the Elizabethan age, then we have great writers like William Shakespeare, like Edmund Spenser, who have written fantastic romantic literature. William Shakespeare's romantic comedies and William Shakespeare's 154 sonnets are full of romanticism. Not only this, Shepherd's Calendar, written by Spenser, and Amoreti Songs, which is a collection of lyrics by Spenser, they are also full of romanticism during the Elizabethan age. But if you come to the period of romantic revival, then we have the great poets like William Wordsworth, the poet of nature, John Keats, the poet of love, Ashley Coleridge, the poet of supernatural, Shelley, P.B. Shelley, all these poets produced the literature, lyrics full of romanticism. Not only this, in the beginning of the 19th century, there were some essayists like Charles Lamb and William Blake who wrote romantic essays in English language. So, friends, now before we finish this discussion, let's have a look at the main differences between classicism and romanticism. Friends, classicism, as I told you in the beginning, it is a movement which followed the ancient poets like Homer, Virgil, and all. And romanticism, it is a movement emerged as a reaction to classicism. Number two, in classicism, much emphasis is given on intellect, on reason, and realism. But on the other hand, in romantic literature, emphasis is given on emotions, on the expression of emotions and imagination. So that means what? Classical literature appeals our brain, our mind, and romantic literature appeals our heart. Okay, why? Because romantic literature is full of emotions and imagination. In classical literature, the writers generally strictly follow the rules of the ancients. But romantic writers, they love freedom from the rules. Classical literature, the authors follow all three unities of time, place, and action, but in romantic literature, only unity of action is followed and unity of time and place are mostly violated by the writers of romantic literature. Moreover, if I talk about the use of language in classical literature, mostly pedantic kind of phraseological, difficult to understand kind of language is used by the classical writers. But if you read romantic literature, simple diction, language of the common man like me and you, simple language is used by the poets. And the last but not the least is the least difference is that in classical literature mostly The artificiality of the urban life, life of the towns, is expressed by the writers. But on the other hand, in Romantic literature, life of nature or the natural life of the rustic people, of the village people, that is mainly expressed in Romantic literature. So, friends, let's conclude the whole discussion by saying that classical writers take their inspiration from the ancient Roman and Greek poets, and Romantic writers, they are inspired by their own intuition. They do not imitate the ancient writers. Neo-classicism flourished during the 18th century in English literature, and Romanticism and Neo-Romanticism flourished in English literature during the 16th and 19th centuries. So, friends, let's sum up by saying that both these movements, classicism and romanticism, are very important for us to understand English literature. So, friends, I finish up here. Thank you. Thank you very much.